All right, hello everybody. I am Michael Richardson, and we're going to be covering Ethiopia's state development analysis. So here's our table of contents, and it's going to kind of shape our argument here of why Ethiopia, how the four eras built it, where it actually stands today, why it got here, and then finally, what to do about it. So here we're going to get to our appraisals in section 3, and then we're going to kind of move on into the theory section. And then we'll get to our recommendations. There's going to be 7 of them, and we're going to go as in depth as I managed. So hopefully it's pretty good. I enjoyed doing it. All right, so now let's get to why Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is often called the unconquered land, um, and Ethiopia as a state has gone through over the last century 4 genuinely distinct operating modes, and yet one consistent ideological thread running underneath all of it. And that's the individual uncolonized development state. That's a thorough line. And then there's the ethnic empire piece, which is the other half of why this country is interesting. Ethiopia has remained largely contiguous. It hasn't come apart in a large sense, despite having formalized secession laws. And every time there's been a rupture and a new ethnic era dawns, with it a whole new system is kind of born, and out of it comes a whole new operating. And that's not typical. Most states don't survive that. So the puzzle in one pairing, Ethiopia sits at an HDI rank of 180 out of 193. Very, very impoverished. And yet you'll see headlines calling it Africa's fastest growing economy. And I think that that kind of contradicting fact is part of the reason why I picked it. All right, so now we're getting into our methodology and our thesis. So for the methodology, really quickly, we have 4 eras, 4 operating modes, and I'm going to treat them as not just them, but development as a corpus, where economic, ethnic, political, external relations all at once. They're not going to be siloed off from one another. And political development is going to get handled comparatively and descriptively, not measured against Western norms, because this is not really a fair yardstick here. And there's a data discipline piece too that I'm going to be upfront about, and that's about statistical inconsistency, specifically whenever we have to reference census and demographic gaps. And I'm going to lean on international and where I can find them federal institutions for financial data, um, because there's going to be a gap there due to the last census being in 2007. So now on to the thesis. And this is really where the spine of everything is going to flow from. And that's going to be that Ethiopia has cycled through numerous iterations of development theory. The imperial period runs on a dependency dynamic in a pretty clear neo-colonial sense. The Derg runs on a command economy, heavily Marxist-Leninist, with real Maoist undertones in how it approaches collectivization. The EPRDF is grounded in a far more world systems position, but it's still really holding on to the Marxist economics underneath it. But it builds a distinctive ethnic institutional framework on top. And then we get the Prosperity Party, which was far more liberally grounded and one could even argue more entrenched in the world systems theory than people would give it credit for. And this is our current era, so it's going to be operating under current modern constraints, and it's going to kind of be the guiding actor for how we're going to measure Ethiopia's relations, both externally and internally now. And so here's the entire thing, that there is this whole cycle of errors that have cascaded repeatedly into attempts to build development capacity, but it failed every single time. And part of that failure was to emphasize comparative advantage. And that's a pattern I keep coming back to, and we're going to hone in on whenever we get to the EPRDF specifically, because as the predecessor of the Prosperity Party, they invested exceptionally heavily in infrastructure and never converted that into real revenue in terms of export value. And I would argue that that principal failure to emphasize the comparative advantage, especially given that Ethiopia is by and large minerally resource endowed country, um, has kind of left a lot out there to be desired. And so that's why we're going to kind of focus in on resource securitization, kind of constraining the artisanal gold sector, because a bunch of that can be covered under Article 40, Section 3 of the Ethiopian Constitution. And we're also going to kind of hone in on expanding state-owned enterprises and town and village enterprises to kind of establish a stronger rural base than what they currently have. And we're going to also look at expanding ethnic endowments. I think a key point of that is going to be like effort from Tigray and Tumsa, and how, it can be kind of wielded wildly by these other ethnic groups inside of Ethiopia, but smaller ones often fall by the wayside as a byproduct. So those are a couple of the core points of the thesis. So I'm going to start getting into our readings and our framework, just kind of looking at some of the anchors for it and kind of building upon the operating mode I'm going to come out of. So for our theoretical anchors, I have two, Pete and Hardwick, and their theories of development, third edition that we've been working with all course. And then also I'm going to pull off Patnick. So I'm going to rely on Pete and Hardwick for the dependency Marxist world system traditions, Patnick more so for finance, capital, imperialism lens, and kind of delinking questions. On data, I'm going to favor international organizations first because they're most publicly available and they're also externally unbiased. And then I'm going to go with credible reporting outlets, then regional and federal statistics. And then finally, I'll go with NGOs for very specific data, such as famine and atrocity data. And then the framework itself, and this is kind of the synthesis pulled out of all those traditions in my own analysis, and that's going to be kind of grounded in command primary, market secondary, state-owned industry, TVE sitting under municipal, regional, federal control across economic areas, but also open to modernist elements where they can help. And in this case, looking specifically at the IMF, World Bank, and the Eurobond financing, as they are kind of propping up the economy right now. But I am not going to argue to expand those. I'm actually going to argue for a slow sequence divergence away from those instruments. And I'm going to argue for an indigenization economic policy to where SOEs, TVEs are assigned to ethnic entities, not just to raw municipalities, which in Ethiopia's case tend to be one and the same anyway. So one deviation from Western normative practice worth flagging up front is I'm going to treat equality of expansion as implicitly gradual. Power as transferred between ethnicity to ethnicity across all four eras, and there's never been a genuinely non-preferential configuration in this country's history. So the mitigation has been run through expanded opportunity, through endowments, and kind of on a timeline that can't really be compressed by outside pressure, such as the IMF style push for rapid liberalization, which is frankly kind of an anathema to this country's history and its current social state anyway. So we have to take that as it is. So now we're going to get to our four eras of development. And so Ethiopia has kind of moved through these four eras of development. You have the Imperial Selassie era first, where Haile Selassie held absolute control over the polity. And through his constitutional dictations, the country essentially ran on a rule of nobility. Most people working the land were kind of nothing more than tenants to it, serfs, if you would. And they had really had no control over the economic policy or political life. And then we kind of get to our first rupture, and that's when the Derg comes in and institutes a heavily militarized Marxist-Leninist kind of Maoist state, collectivization, nationalization of industry, the whole apparatus. And they pushed on collectivized agricultural infrastructure extremely hard. And it failed, and the state farms got priority access to everything and still only produced roughly 6% of agricultural output. And they poured in massive amounts of resources into the military, one of the highest budget priorities of the era, some 10.28% GDP by 1989, the all-time high, and it was sustaining what was at that point the sub-Saharan Africa's largest standing army. Partially a function of the civil war, partially the inter-ethnic conflict that followed the coup, but in the end, we got our second rupture, and that's when the Derg collapses and power transfers to the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. The new pseudo-electoral system and effective power concentration pulled in the Tigray, and it was a group that was only roughly 6% of the population. So now under the EPRDF, you get this expansion of these regional endowments, effort foremost, and it heavily favored Tigray, generating something like 60% of Tigray's own regional revenue. And growth of the state-owned industry and kind of the pseudo-market liberalization and a sort of formal turn away from collectivized agriculture, though honestly it was still pretty much, land transformation, but not at scope that it would have been. But people were technically free to leave. So they kept some of the policies the same, some of it didn't. And then we get our 2018 rupture where the EPRDF falls and power transfers now to the Prosperity Party. And the Prosperity Party was a predominantly Oromo regime, and it obviously favored the Oromo population, but it also stuck with some of the EPRDF's late industrialization capacities. And it was something that just couldn't stand as going back to our comparative um, advantage argument. It didn't produce what it needed to produce for Ethiopia, and exports did not rise, and instead they were stagnant for about 10 years. And it has led to the debt run up and eventual default in 2023. So with that short little summary over, let's kind of start digging into the eras themselves and understanding them a little bit better. So for the Salasa era, it genuinely there was an interesting shift in Ethiopian politics. The newly crowned emperor right before World War II established the first constitution in 1931, and that gave marginal democratic reforms and kind of expanded the administrative state and kind of kicked off some of the earliest major infrastructure investment in the country's history. Relative stability and its longest reigning of the four eras occurred, 33 years to be specific, but this is following post 1941. The numbers roughly added up to about 3.4% average growth per year, though the 60s into the 70s were a little bit higher, growing near 4.4%. Though while the budget sheets were balanced, it was generally pretty thin on taxes, and the tax base didn't really expand very much, only about 5.3% of the entire GDP. And the economy stayed about 71% agriculture during the time, with manufacturing barely cracking about 3%, and coffee running up some 50 to 60% of the entire export bracket. And externally, this was all defined by kind of American patronage. Roughly 90% of the 1950s external debt was owned by the United States, with something like 475 million birr in military aid coming to them, and 800 million in economic aid. So, what really kind of brings him down was his failure to kind of reform. And you kind of get that through the Bale revolt and the famine in Wolo above all, and that just bred growing instability through the late years of his rule, and eventually ended with a coup that would overthrow him and wind up with most of his regime executed. So with the overthrow, the country falls fully into the grip of a multi-ethnic conflict. And the Eritrean War of Secession also occurred at this time, which had actually started back in 61 under Selassie, but it escalated into full-scale war and kind of consumed the entire Derg's tenure. And the actual loss of the coastline comes later after the fall of the Derg. Um, so Ethiopian independence 91 and 93, and that's kind of the structural break you'll see annotated in the very long data series from here on. Um, the Derg's tenure averaged per capita growth of roughly about zero point 0.2 to negative 1.0. And it's by far the worst sustained record out of any of the four eras, and it was violently volatile with it, ranging from plus 5.3 in 83 to minus 5.2 in 84, and then minus 13.5 in 85. There's another famine that occurred that year. And then 2 years later, you jump up to plus 10.1 in 87. So then the negative kind of just straight through every single year, all the way up until 91. So external debt climbed around this time from about $1.8 billion in 1980 towards $8 to $10 billion under Soviet patronage. There was massive loans going towards military hardware, with campaigns against the various ethnic resistances, just seeping money out. And poverty kind of deepened in 84, 85, and the famine in and of itself killed somewhat on the order of about a million people. And with military spending peaking at about 10.28% of GDP in 89, the productive economy was structurally starved of all sort of investment. And the collapse of the military in 1991 as a result of a defeat finally ended with them writing a new constitution and kind of casting off a lot of the Derg's reforms, albeit they were able to bake in something that the Derg had worked on themselves, and that being the ethnic question and specifically understanding secession in the new ethnic states. So here we finally start to get into what I cast as our main characters, and that's the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. So the EPRDF era produced by and large some of the strongest human development track of all of them. And that's pretty much across every single metric, looking at poverty, HDI growth. And it gets there through late developer borrowing, which is honestly a part of the reason why I can't really cast off the liberal Western institutions in my framework, because without them, you would not have gotten the development growth that Ethiopia actually got, especially coming out of the Derg's collapse, which was not a pleasant time. And the kind of capstone number of this era was GDP growth officially averaging about 10.9% a year from 2004 to 2014. And that's about a per capita average of 8%. And consistent double-digit growth on official figures for roughly a decade straight, although IMF estimates run a little bit lower. That's part of the reason I wanted to flag inconsistent data earlier. So one of the era's best conceived ideas, and ultimately one of its casualties in transition, was the endowment system. And the EPRDF gave regions, specifically Tigray, above all of the others, as it was the dominant power in the coalition, access to funds for internal investment. And I think that the data generally supports that this is a good idea. And alongside it, the ethnic federal framework grants the right to secession and functionally emancipates regions to kind of make their own decisions about their own betterment. Now, you could argue, look at the debt they racked up, and yes, it was significant, but I would argue it invested in some sectors that weren't the best choice, but the debt itself isn't really the EPRDF's defining problem. And this is, by every metric, as I've mentioned, one of the most prosperous periods and one of the longest reigning periods, bar Haile Selassie's period. And that says something on its own, as even though it kind of is able to trace in part back to that same ethnic federation, its fall, it truly was a double-edged sword from the start. Being born into that new ethnic system, embracing it, and it in part kind of taking it and some of its better ideas out along with it. And this here is kind of theoretically where I'd like place it, as the EPRDF kind of sits inside the world systems as a larger constraint layer, um, where you have kind of the developmental state is like the structuralist agenda. And it's kind of Marxist in its lineage, operating as the subsidiary layer underneath. And that's kind of where actual state agency lives. And they really had no influence at global level. And they've been relegated to a semi-peripheral position, leaning hard on investment from the core. Western institutions on one side, and even reaching out to Chinese BRI lending on the other. And so it kind of sits in the middle of the line, honestly. And the Marxist tendencies, but far less fundamentalist, more structuralist, and more modernist, to make it less Marx-Lenin than it would have been the Derg prior. And I think that that balancing fact and the kind of more Ethiopian-driven lens of the ethnic framework and regional investment built up a system that stands out amongst itself and makes it more integratable with multiple different regions. And it truly did indigenize some ideas that were functional, such as the endowments. Although I will say at the end of the day, it was kind of constrained by the scope of its actual influence. And so here we kind of bring ourselves into the fourth era of Ethiopian development, and that is the Prosperity Party. And when the rupture hit the EPRDF, you kind of had this power transition to the Prosperity Party in 2018. And as that happens, you start to see a real shift in the orthodoxy, where regional and federal SOEs were kind of still prevalent, but there's a transition towards parsing out agricultural land to foreign capital through long-term leases, and land can actually be sold per se under Article 4003. So the leasing mechanism was kind of the best they were able to get without reforming the Constitution. Um, and you kind of get a resurgence of the EPRDF's kind of leftover problem, and that was the rapid debt acclimation. With little material export to show for it, it truly comes back to hit the Prosperity Party as a default. In December 2023, that's exactly what happens. And so the Prosperity Party, which is still fairly young compared to the other three, is dealing with crises of its entirely of its own making, largely from the power shift away from Tigray towards Oromo, and it's kind of started this whole new rash of ethnic conflicts. The Tigray War is the foremost example of that, but they're also kind of pressuring the Amhara region as well, um, and pulling endowments here and there, which is causing more problems for the economy. So they're just kind of compounding these new issues of their own making on top of the pre-existing issues from the EPRDF. So while it's still young, it is beginning to compound issues much like its predecessors. So having kind of diagnosed all their issues, kind of placing them on the theoretical scale of where they kind of fall, and kind of looking at some of the trailing issues that they've left behind for one another. Now we have to push on and look at the growth across eras. And so the growth across eras here kind of is deeply inconsistent. I think that the prevalence of the variance is a part of the question, and is the comparison to be had. Um, and so if we start with like Selassie, you have consistent if low, around 3.4% per year, and per capita averaging about 4.4% through the 60s. But it's still the early development period, so they're laying roads, telecom. It's kind of the first foundation of these expanding state enterprises. And then we get the Derg, and their period was exceptionally volatile with a high of plus 0.10, 1 or 10.1 in the 87, with a low of minus 13.5 in the 85 famine year, and pretty much negative through 88 to 91, averaging negative 0.02 to negative 1 per capita, pretty much the entire tenure they were in. And by far the worst sustained record of any of the eras. You have mass poverty, wage stagnation, almost nothing in exports. SOEs did expand beyond even the imperial period, but the debt grew right alongside them. You had first a domestic rise in debt, then increasing Soviet reach out because they needed the specifically military acquisition, with debt externally climbing from 1.8 billion towards 10 billion. And then you had pretty much this expanding campaign, which required even more money against these other ethnic resistances. Then we get to the EPRDF, and that is by far the most successful and most growth-oriented period, officially averaging about 10.9% from '04 to 14, with poverty falling from 38.7 to 23.5%, HDI climbing from 0.293 to 0.486, and a two-thirds gain at that, which is pretty impressive. And you had rising standard of living, and all of that. You had pretty strong debt expansion, but that comes from the developmental state push and expanding out industrial complexes, and kind of regional and local developments or endowments, and expanding state-owned enterprises. So we also see with the Prosperity Party that that run up runs straight into default, with Ethiopia now undergoing kind of massive debt restructuring, including with the Eurobond specifically, as well as outside, kind of the Western Sphere expanding into, BRICS, the New Development Bank, and the such. But nonetheless, interestingly enough, you still have continued growth, although there is pretty significant increase in certain poverty indices. So now what we're going to do is we're going to leave section two and we're going to begin going into more of the direct development appraisal, leaving some of the theoretical stuff behind us. Um, and we're going to kind of appraise where all of that before has left the country off and kind of go from there. So we have starting economic internal, specifically looking at the growth and structure. And from here, we're going to look at kind of like the internal economics. And there's a trend that shows up basically in every single development matrix you look at, and that's a divergence between what the state says and what the international organizations say. And here, atypically for me, I'm actually going to lean into the international organizations, the IMF specifically, and the World Bank. Um, because there's genuinely something about Ethiopia's situation that makes data genuinely gameable. Part of that's the ethnic interplay. The incumbent has the incentive to make the numbers look good and better than the previous administrations. And it's worth saying that the incentive was operating under that same incentive was operating under the EPRDF as well. So this divergence is a structural principle to the state. It's not about one ethnicity's tenure, it's kind of across the board. So let's look at some of the actual numbers for 2023 and 2024. The AFBD claims run up around 8.1 and 7.6, while the IMF shows kind of closer to 7.1% for 24 to 25. That gap continues to widen. And the government says 8.9, AFDB says 9.8. The IMF also will retort back and say 6.6. So that's pretty consistent over projection, though I would kind of want to be fair here. Say that doesn't mean the growth isn't real. I mean, nightlight data corroborates real ongoing expansion. The dispute is over the magnitude, not necessarily the direction. And for consistency, that's why I'm going to kind of stick with the IMF series throughout pretty much the ongoing rest of this. So kind of underneath the growth number, you have the structure. And as of right now, you have 35.8% of that GDP sits in agriculture. And that is pretty impressive, with only 24.5% being in industry, of which manufacturing is only about 4%, um, and 37% in services as well. And underneath that, looking at employment on the slide, you have agriculture sitting at about 62 to 70% of all employment. So you got about 35 to 36% of the GDP being produced by 62 to 70% of all employment. And that's pretty overweight categorically. And what is kind of a fallout of this is that you have these non-participating rural establishments, rural households that are producing goods, but they're not producing at scale. And it's an environment that it kind of is susceptible to geography, going back to the droughts that led into the Wollo famine and led into the 85 famine. And these rural communities largely stay put and they're stuck in their ethnic ways, holding on to pastoral and sustenance life rather than migrating towards cities, which is a real condensing effect on growth and on wages. And the clearest example of this is industry, 24.5% of GDP producing about 6.5% of national employment. That's abysmal. And agricultural GDP weight runs about 3.5 times the world average for context. So services at 31% employment isn't shocking. The U.S. runs close to 80, but the crux of it is 4% manufacturing figure. Despite everything EPRDF poured into industrial complexes, it's stuck there still. and kind of set the export slog, there's just really no movement in that area, and you're not getting revenue off that sector. And that's a big part of why debt repayment on loans that built those industrial bases turned into such a swing and a miss, leading up to that inevitable default. So here we have the kind of economic, external, and trade and debt, staying on the topic of debt and defaulting. Trade really is kind of where the EPRDF's model breaks down. For all of the infrastructure and all of the industrial parks, the one thing that had to happen was converting that build out into export revenue. And that never happened. Look at the export line. Goods exports sat flat. Um, and they set flat at about $3 billion for the better part of a decade through the mid to late 2010s. And meanwhile, all that debt that they used to kind of build out that capacity just kept compounding. And that's kind of the entire gap, and that's really the whole story of the crisis that follows. But an interesting thing, and kind of something to hold on to, because we'll come back to it, is there's one sector that quietly held on, and that was gold. The material export base never really fully disappeared, but its attention was more so shifted towards parks and the EPRDF's own reign whenever it would round down. So would the formal gold production channels. And then whenever finally power had shifted from the Tigray favoring EPRDF to the Oromo anchored Prosperity Party and conflict broke out, um, all of that would pretty much go underground and kind of become militant controlled. Um, and I mean, there's a pretty interesting case of this in the data on the slide, and that's that while yes, it kind of vanished off the books, um, it didn't stop, and you can see that within the UAE recorded 15 metric tons that had came in through their formal means versus the supposed 9 metric tons on the Ethiopian books that they had produced that year in 2021. And so, to an extent, that goes to show that there was this prevalent artisanal sector that may have been pulling out as much as the formal channel. And that in and of itself is something to kind of hold on to for later on in the presentation. So, kind of putting it all together, you have the debt build out from the industrial period plus the failure to turn it into revenue, kind of left the Prosperity Party at best ill equipped to handle ballooning payments. And that's kind of what led to the default, right? But that debt pile was not enormous by world standards. But a debt pile with no export base underneath it to actually service it, that is the breach. And that was what the IMF flagged. It wasn't necessarily the size of the debt, it was that external debt hit 180% of exports against a 150% threshold that they had in place. And it really becomes a denominator problem because it was that debt servicing was eating a quarter of government revenue. And that wasn't because the debt was large, but that was more so because the export base underneath it was just so small. So I really wanted to, before we get into the politics and the ethnics, I wanted to kind of explore the security side of this, um, because security is pretty much going to be the constraining factor on everything that comes downstream, including previous things such as militant control of gold, like we just discussed. And Ethiopia right now is facing threats on essentially every front at once. Internally, the Prosperity Party is fighting armed insurgencies on multiple ethnic fronts simultaneously. The biggest is the Amhara Fano insurgency, which kicked off in 2023 after the government tried to dissolve the Amhara regional forces. And it has displaced over 100,000 people and pulled some 4.5 million kids out of school. And at the same time, you have the Oromo Liberation Army, which is running its own insurgency inside of Oromia. And that's pretty much the government's own ethnic base. And the violence is not one directional. You have Fano, which has massacred Oromo civilians in Woga, and then you have Amhara communities, which have reported massacres against them in Oromia, and you have federal drone strikes that have killed civilians at a human rights monitoring level. These human rights monitors keep flagging And it is quintessentially ballooning into the premise that the state is fighting in every single direction, including within itself. And then to pile on that, Tigray itself is not resolved either. The Tigray War from 2021 is still ongoing, and while the Pretoria Agreement has held, Western Tigray is still widely contested, and there is even a prevalence of Eritrean forces and troops that are still implicated in abuses in the region. And the Tigray Defense Forces, which are still a couple 100,000 strong, have split internally, partially over control of resources, including the aforementioned gold. And then there's the interstate risk of Eritrea, where Ethiopia has lost its coastline when Eritrea seceded in 93, and the Prosperity Party has made regaining Red Sea access an open objective, with Abiy actually saying back in 2023 that Ethiopia will fight for it. And relations have sharply deteriorated pretty much throughout all of 2025 to the point where there is real concern about an Ethiopian move towards the port of Assab. And that kind of pulls in outside powers because Ethiopia's development has been heavily underwritten by the Gulf. The UAE alone, with some $5 billion in agricultural, manufacturing, port access, drone financing, and that's propped up the state through its pretty much worst internal moments. But here's kind of more exposure. The Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf heavyweight, is now investing in Eritrea's Assad. So it's quintessentially backing Ethiopia's own adversaries' ports, specifically to strengthen Eritrean defense. And in late 2025, the Saudi UAE relationship itself has ruptured. So Ethiopia's two biggest external backers now having opposite sides of the very border it's threatening. And on top of that, Ethiopia sits in a pretty precarious position on a Red Sea smuggling corridor that arms the Houthis. While it's a less active supporter, more as kind of just a permissive node, like a state that has little incentive to kind of police the routes that it doesn't directly threaten it, um, it's still by proxy a route. And every one of these threats bears directly on the resource base. I'm going to argue is Ethiopia's only way forward. And that's exactly why I think that security is not a side issue, and is pretty much a load-bearing pillar for everything that follows. So now we get to the ethnic and political. So Ethiopia's ethnic composition is genuinely hard to pin down, and that's worth saying up front. The most recent census is from 2007, like I said earlier, and that's nearly 2 decades old now. That composition could be pretty much the same today, or it could look radically different, and we simply don't have the current data to check. As I flagged in the methodology, I'll treat the 2007 numbers as the working data with the caveat that it may not be the most accurate. But on that basis, Ethiopia is one of the most diverse states on the planet. Around 90 ethnic groups, roughly 80 languages, major groups, the Oromo, around 36% of the population, the Amhara, 27%, Somali and Tigray, about 6% each, and Sidama, about 4%. Amharic is the working federal language, and through the Constitution, lets individual jurisdictions pick their own. And the country splits almost evenly along Christian and Muslim populations. And that is a fault line that runs deep, deeper than any of the other four eras. It has shaped imperial succession itself, with the heir Ieyasu um, getting deposed in 1916 on the suspicion of converting to Islam and aligning with the Ottomans in the First World War, and that cleared the pathway for Empress Zetitu, and as regent and her heir behind her, the future Emperor Haile Selassie, a Christian imperial order at the time, governing a country that was nearly half Muslim, and that's a tension that any regime that's older than any of the regimes we've talked about. Ethiopia's long run on elite capture has produced genuinely mixed results. A lot of the pain arriving at the same seams every time an era ends and power transfers along ethnic lines, um, sometimes at the cost of actual territory, like the loss of Eritrea in the 90s. Um, it's genuinely been a mixed bag on who would take power, such as the smaller population Tigray in the previous transfer for the EPRDF. But the Dergs is an interesting outlier here. outlier here, and they pursued assimilation as real repression against ethnic populations. But they also took the nationalities question pretty seriously as an actual question, and in doing that, they helped to elevate, sorry, the issue to a level that led directly to the EPRDF building an explicit ethnic federalist state. So the Derg's violence and its intellectual seriousness about ethnicity both fed forward into one, trauma, and then the other, the constitutional order that came after it. And that is an interesting premise because despite all of the work that they did, the favoritism hasn't stopped. The Tigrayan-led EPRDF getting replaced by the Oromo-led Prosperity Party, and the cycle just continues to reopen old grudges and producing new conflict. And important for a development analysis, you get a cross pattern where outcomes more or less kind of just track ethnic lines. And so now we get to external relations. Let's kind of close this appraisal where Ethiopia's position gets genuinely pretty interesting and genuinely pretty precarious. And it starts with the fact that changes how you could read everything else. Ethiopia is a very populous state, the second most populous in Africa after Nigeria, something like 136 million, with a median age roughly under 20 by about sitting at about 2 million people hitting working age every single year. And that scale matters because that it means Ethiopia isn't a small state gambling recklessly by playing all sides. It's a big enough state to be a sort of courted prize. And that's why the Gulf powers compete for it instead of dictating to it. And it's exactly what makes the hedging strategy I'm about to lay out viable instead of suicidal. So here's what Ethiopia is actually doing. On one axis, it's tethered to the aging Western order. You have the Eurobond restructuring. You have the IMF and the World Bank programs propping up the economy even as they constrain it, while tilting towards China pretty hard, buying into the Belt and Road, lending, and now taking significant steps to join the BRICS-aligned New Development Bank. Though I'll be precise that administration has been approved there, it's just not been finalized. And so the kind of capital subscription there is still pending and no money's been dispersed to them yet. So that's a legible, I would say, east-west hedge that they're beginning to develop or have developed over recent decades. But look at the second axis here, and it stops being legible. Ethiopia is embedded in what analysts call a UAE-Israel alignment, and that's a bloc that's anti-Iran and shifting to be anti-Saudi. And yet China, the patron it's leaning towards on the first axis, is Iran's backer and is currently courting Saudi Arabia too. So Ethiopia is simultaneously moving towards China and partnered with a coalition arrayed against China's own Middle East partners. The alignments just don't resolve into a serious block. They're non-transitive. In a clean bipolar world, your partner's rivals are your rivals. Ethiopia breaks that rule and kind of rides both sides of the same rivalry at once. And in a bipolar world, sure, that's fatal. But in a multipolar one, it's leverage. And that's honestly kind of the beauty of the system, right up until it isn't. And you can't just theorize where it breaks. You know, it's kind of already happening next door in Sudan, and that's that Ethiopia backs the RSF alongside the UAE, while Eritrea and Tigrayan fighters back the Sudanese army alongside Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The Ethiopian-Eritrea rivalry and the federal Tigray conflict both fought by proxy inside of Sudan. And in February 2026, Reuters reported that Ethiopia is hosting a RSF training camp with Emirati support near the border. And analysts note that Ethiopia and Kenya's gold figures doubling in the same period suggests that both may be conduits for RSF-linked gold that are flowing to the same endpoint as we saw in the trade data at Dubai. Even Russia is hedging both sides, angling for a naval base at the port of Sudan. It's truly everybody's playing everybody. So the vulnerability the hedge creates playing all sides works while you're strong and the system stays fluid. Ethiopia is neither. right now. Economically, it's emaciated. Militarily, it's stretched amongst three internal fronts and an Eritrean standoff. And that's where Egypt comes in, because Egypt's the sharp edge of the downside. Egypt views the GERD as which is a developmental dam Ethiopia is building at the kind of not the mouth of the Nile, but not the base of the Nile, but on the Nile, as an existential threat. And that's kind of Cairo's own framing. And it's already aligned with every one of Ethiopia's adversaries, Eritrea, Tigrayan, Sudanese army, and that makes Ethiopia's position weaker. Increasingly, opportunistically, Egypt is sitting in a better position, but Egypt doesn't need to invade. Egypt can just continue to squeeze Ethiopia through Sudan, through Eritrea, and use those vectors um, to continue to tighten its grip and weaken Ethiopia. And the kind of appraisal's closing note is the multipolar order. And that's the whole consequence of it. It's a bet. Multipolarity stays fluid, that Ethiopia is kind of strong enough to maintain that, and it continues to be a courted prize. Um, but both are eroding right now, and that's something that creates a tension that has to be addressed in the recommendations. And as those blocks become more solid, uh, eventually someone may make that choice for you or for Ethiopia. So this brings us to our verdict. Where does this leave us with the appraisal? Ethiopia has made real significant gains, most under the EPRDF, continuing under the Prosperity Party. Poverty has been slashed, quality of life and human development indicators improved region-wide, even if unevenly, and the EPRDF saw a rapid build-out of industrial capacity, an enormous run-up in services. Even if that's not necessarily where you want you'd want that labor to land. Generally, the shrinking of the bloated, entrenched agricultural sector is cause for cautious hope. Um, the hope being that labor eventually migrates towards industry, where Ethiopia could actually find its comparative advantage. But and this is the honest counterweight. The record shows that labor didn't go to industry; it went to services, and industrial employment sat flat around 6.5% for going on 30 years now. That's the transition that didn't happen, and that is exactly what any forward strategy has to confront, which connects the core failure, the massive industrial buildout, and the failure of the late EPRDF and the early Prosperity Party to convert into state revenue, export revenue specifically. And it has now saddled the state with a default and debt restructuring that continue to fail the Ethiopian people. Exports still lag. The shift between agriculture and services just isn't enough to stop the slide. And yet the state's still posting heavy economic data. It lags the mid to late EPRDF, but growth's held consistent. And one of the genuine bright spots is the post-float gold sector, posting almost a tenfold turnaround from just 2 or 3 years prior. But gold and most of Ethiopia's commodities remain plagued by inter-ethnic militant violence and by what looks like hesitation or honestly retaliation against regions that fared better under the EPRDF. Tigray chief among them. Tigray has consistently, even suspiciously, posted significant gold production and floated significant exports, even when it's flowing through smuggling and militant channels or artisanal ones. To put a number on the suspicion, Tigray supplied nearly 19 tons to the National Bank last fiscal year against an estimated artisanal capacity of barely 2. That gap in and of itself is the story. The resource bed inside of Ethiopia has the potential to be a great equalizing factor, but only if three things happen. Threats of militancy get rectified, the artisanal sector gets brought under the scope of legitimacy, and captured inflows that may be illegitimate get made to be legitimate, leveraging Ethiopia's location into a genuine resource hub. Which brings us to the last piece of the appraisal, and honestly, the one that overshadowed everything. Eritrea is the stark example of what interethnic conflict can do to a state's integrity. It cost Ethiopia its coastline. Tigray's a painful, costly, persistent vision of the same threat, now under an Oromo-led core. And it doesn't stop there. As Oromo-helmed institutions push into Amhara territory, that region's taken up arms too. Reining this in, restructuring it, building a working relationship among ethnic groups, that's not optional. It's necessary. It not just for the Prosperity Party to survive, but for Ethiopia to remain a contiguous state at all. And the resource potential on one side, the ethnic and the security fractures on the other, is exactly what the recommendations have to reconcile. So, section 4, why did it actually play out this way? Now we can really start to get into the cascading events here a little bit more in depth and their causality to our current situation. So, imperial dependency and the Dark Command. Um, all right. Basically, let's start applying theory era by era, and the imperial period under Selassie is where we a lot of what Ethiopia is gets kind of set because Selassie sets a genuine contradiction. And honestly, the contradiction is the whole analysis. Read through a dependency lens, Ethiopia under Selassie was doing two opposite things at the same time. Externally, it's a periphery. After the Italian occupation, Britain carries Selassie back to the throne. He'd spent his entire exile in England. And from there, the dependency swings into full effect, above all with the United States. And I want to be careful here because this isn't dependency as crude extraction. Nobody's strip mining the country. It's subtler. It's more structural kind incorporation into Western Bloc on subordinate terms through aid, military patronage, strategic alignment. And that's kind of the clearest artifact of it is the Kekanu station, the U.S. listing post in Asamara, um, effectively traded for aid flowing in. Ethiopia wasn't looted. I mean, it was groomed, slotted into the Western system as a Cold War client. Its development financed, its posture aligned. That's Patnick's finance capital lens and dependency tradition doing exactly what they were built to describe. But here's kind of the sharp counterpart to that. While Ethiopia is a periphery to the west, it's simultaneously a core to its own internal south. And this is the center periphery internal colonial reading. The northern Amharan, Tigrayan Highland core consolidated through Melnik, Haile Selassie's grandfather, great grandfather, conquests in the late 19th century and perpetuated under Selassie even further, extending the administrative control and the cultural dominance over these southern peoples. The Amhara, the Oromo, the Somali, the conquered South. Selassie's ruling an explicitly Christian imperial order over a country that was nearly half Muslim, and it generated real ethnic tension, real violence. So Ethiopia is experiencing dependency and practicing sub-imperialism at the same time. It's peripheral and imperial in the same body, and Selassie is that doubling genuinely kind of made flesh. Abroad, he's a giant, the Pan-Africanist statesman hosting, and founding the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa in 1963, the predecessor to today's African Union. All the while professing a post-colonial order, the figure who literally becomes the Messiah to the Rastafari. Yet at home, in that same stretch, you had the Wollo famine that kills enormous numbers of his own people, and rather than do anything, he conceals it, letting his own countrymen languish while performing liberal modernism, a rewritten constitution, a Western show, a post-colonial liberator on the continental stage, and an internal emperor concealing a famine at home. That's a contradiction in his image, and the concealed famine is what part that kind of brings him down, which directly hands us to the Derg. Because the Derg is the absolutist answer to the same question Selassie failed to resolve. What is Ethiopia? And how do you hold it together? The Derg's answer is Soviet-aligned Marxist-Leninism. And I mean Soviet specifically because the patron itself, the Soviet Union, the model, the aid, the templates, all of it coming from Moscow, not Beijing. The vanguard party, the command economy, the state farms, the forced collectivization and villagization. These are Soviet blueprints underwritten by something like $11 billion in Soviet military aid. The project is ideological unity, dissolving the differences, forging one homogeneous socialist Ethiopian people. And the collectivization piece blows up in their face the same way it did for Mao in the Great Leap. Forced collectivization colluding with drought, um, producing just these catastrophic famine in 84 and 85. But here's the thread that actually matters the most because it's kind of what makes these four eras one story instead of four separate boxes. The the Derg adopts the Leninist framework on the nationalities question, the same doctrine Lenin used in turning the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, formally kind of recognizing these ethnic groups as nations with theoretical rights of self-determination, even while crushing any actual ethnic movement in practice. The Derg elevates this nationalities question to a first order of the problem of the state, and that recognition, the ethnic nationhood, at least in theory, is exactly what the EPRDF inherits and turns into the constitutional ethnic federalism, right down to the secession clause. So the intellectual lineage runs Lenin to the Derg's nationalities policy to Article 39 in the EPRDF's constitution. And Selassie tried to hold Ethiopia together through Christian imperial unity, and it failed. The Derg tried through Marxist homogeneous unity, and it failed. Each failure hangs the same unanswered question forward, and it's the EPRDF's radically different answer to it that we turn to next. So I wildly monologued there for a minute, and I'm going to do it again because it is a point of this development theory that is so important to kind of understanding a functional framework for what could answer Ethiopia's major problems, specifically looking at the nationalities. And I want to start this with kind of the EPRDF's layered framework. So the EPRDF kind of inherits this nationalities framework from the Derg. And the Derg had been building on it, the Leninist idea of a multi-ethnic state, but it does something neither predecessor could really do. And to see why you actually have to start with how it came to power, because the way the Derg fell is really the whole key. The Derg collapses under its own weight, ruinous economics, inflamed ethnic tensions, and then the Soviet patron just vanishes out from underneath them. And there is the whole thing that happens almost by accident. In destroying itself, the Derg severs both of the superpower ties. It unleashes Ethiopia from both potential masters. Selassie had fastened Ethiopia to the Americans, whereas the Derg had fastened Ethiopia to the Soviets. And when the Derg's Soviet bet explodes, Ethiopia comes out the other side beholden to neither one. And I'm not calling the Derg good. They were catastrophic. But the sheer happenstance of their own collapse, they liberate Ethiopia from both prevailing superpowers. And that vacuum is exactly what hands the EPRDF something no prior Ethiopian regime has had. And that is actual agency to choose where to go next. And that's the answer to the agency question right there. It wasn't handed to them from out of strength. It fell out of a wreckage. It was real because Meles Zinwa now had the proclivity to use it. Now the theory has to be read in two layers at once here because a single lens, I would argue, misses the greater whole. And that's the constraint layer is world systems. Ethiopia sits in a semi-periphery, a structural position that denies it a core seat. Basically, it dictates that the menu of options is balanced. No prior regime escaped that position, and the EPRDF does not either. The collapse gave them something that wasn't a way out of the periphery, it was the freedom to work within the margin of the periphery. And that leverage one core against the other instead of being captive to one single patron um, is the whole gambit. And the world system explains why the menu looked the way it did. The agency layer is a completely different part, and that is the developmental state. And this is what Meles actually did with that menu. He rejected the pure delinking. You can hear Pete and Hardwick's critical modernism directly here. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some functional pieces left in the Western system, right? And especially when you look at the finance capital, that is definitely worth keeping, especially post Derg. So basically, the EPRDF picks up and chooses what it wants from the system. Western finance, where it works, Chinese capital and Belt and Road, where that works, the aid system, where it's useful. An a la carte model. No, no single patron regime could have run. And Meles didn't just do this; he theorized it. He argued for a development state explicitly as the escape route from the neoliberal dead end. The world system was offering the African states, that is a rare case of a ruler who articulated both layers of himself: the constraint and the way to work it. And what the agency actually produced, because this is the thesis in miniature, I would argue. Basically, the EPRDF takes two entirely different foreign templates and Ethiopianizes both of them. The Leninist nationalities doctrine and the subnational development vehicle idea, the regional endowments, the thing that rhymes with China's town and village enterprises, and it fuses them on an axis that neither one could originally ever have used. And China organized its enterprises by locality. The EPRDF rebases the whole apparatus not on locality but on ethnicity. And that's not importing a model, that's re-engineering one, a foreign concept on an indigenous predicate. And the endowments are Leninism plus TVE compiled into a whole new ethnic architecture. And it gets enshrined constitutionally, expanded ethnic regions, and genuinely unprecedented step of writing in the principle of a secession right into the Constitution, especially in the wake of Eritrea's departure. And for a while, look at the Tigray before the transition. It actually worked. You had a ruling coalition drawn from 6% of the population, governing on a framework, at least in principle, that opened all of the state to all of the Ethiopians. Now, does that layered frame actually hold, or am I just pushing it out there and asserting it? And I would say here's kind of the test, and it runs both directions here because you could take the DERG and the EPRDF, the roughly the same semi-peripheral position, similar external hostility, even accounting for the loss of the coast when Eritrea seceded. If the world system determines outcomes, the two regimes should look alike. They don't. One posted negative growth for pretty much its entire existence. The other one posted a decade of near double-digit growth and two-thirds gain in human development. Structure didn't produce the gap. It was, I would argue, agency that produced it, and that's the first direction. But we can run it the other way as well, because it matters just as much. The EPRDF also fails. Not a violent collapse like the Derg, but it loses the plot and loses the state the same way through the failure to convert the investment into revenue. A enormous run-up of debt with no export base underneath it. And here's the point. The EPRDF's failure was a different shape, a different cause than the Derg's. The Derg failed ideological rigidity, and it also failed because it lost its patron. The EPRDF failed in an incomplete conversion, investing in the wrong place, the same structural position, two completely different failure modes. So world systems can't explain the variance in either direction, not why successes differed, not why failures differed. It's kind of four different data points. You have the Derg's failure, the EPRDF's success, and the EPRDF's failure. And the only variable that tracks them all is what each regime converted its position into, which is the thesis arriving not as an assertion, but as a residual. That the thing left standing once the structural explanation is ran out. And that last data point, the EPRDF's conversion failure, is more or less, I think, where we will go from here. So now that we have kind of like ended on this second arm of this falsification test here. The EPRDF didn't, succeed differently from the DERG. It didn't just succeed differently from the DERG, I guess I should say. It failed in different. It failed differently too. The autopsy of the failure um, is kind of the mechanism at the center of what I would say is my entire argument. And that is, as the EPRDF's model matures, it runs up against substantial foreign-owned debt. And through aggressive expansion of their industrial complex, the parks, the bigger mega projects, and I want to be clear because it's where people can get it wrong. Debt itself isn't the problem. Infrastructure debt is normal for a developing country. You would be very pressed to find a single one that does not have it. It is a standard engine of late development. You borrow to build what you don't have yet. And I would say that the dilemma is what came next, or what really, in this instance, didn't come next. There was no conversion mechanism present. The industrial complexes never got turned around into export-driven commodities. You built the capacity, but you never captured the revenue. And so what you get is probably the worst possible combination of a massive run-up in debt and no way to pay it off. And the industrial development stagnates, stuck around 6.5% of employment, flat for years, the latter half of the 2010s. And basically, with exports staying flat, uh, right at about $3 billion for the better part of that decade, while the debt continues to compound. That gap between the compounding liabilities and the flat earnings, that's the entire failure in one image, and you can see it show up in the currency. You can go back to the chart comparing the GDP local currency against the GDP in dollars, and the Burr line absolutely skyrockets in the 2010s and climbs just astronomically. And the market sustained inflation, high inflation, compounding with currency collapse. I mean, that is quintessentially not necessarily hyperinflation technically, but like it's a debt to currency spiral, and numbers just can't hide that. I mean, looking at the most stable international currency versus theirs, it's kind of obvious. And the final piece here is that the next administration inherits all of it with absolutely no way to cope. They have flat exports, compounding debt, collapsing currency, and it culminates in Ethiopia's default in 2023. And on a euro bond, the EPRDF itself had issued back in 2014. So the verdict of the developmental state era is precise, and it's not a simple failure. Infrastructure built, human development delivered, the poverty reduction, the HDI gains, all of that stuff actually happened. It's just that they could never convert the export capacity. And the default is basically the bill for the one piece that was missing, and it just so happened to land on the Prosperity Party's desk. So, I mean, with the bill finally coming due, landing on the Prosperity Party's desk, you have like what will seem like a shorter section, like I'm less involved in it, and it is going to be shorter, and it's not an oversight on mine. I don't believe. It's just kind of the finding of my own kind of involvement here is because it's it's been the pattern across the past three eras. Every one of them have offered a development doctrine. Selassie, dependency modernism or modernization. The Derek had command Marxism. The EPRDF had a developmental state theorized by its own leader. And then now the Prosperity Party doesn't really have a comparable doctrine. What it has is Medimber, and it's kind of a syncretic slogan basically, and it's not a theory and a practice. It's in practice it's more or less orthodox liberalization, the currency float, the IMF program, privatization, opening the banking sector. The rhetoric's all post-ideological, and the content's textbook neoliberal. The Prosperity Party isn't an authoring model. It's a managing the EPRDF's wreckage while placing one strategic bet, and that bet is generally a new move of this era, the multipolar gamble. The political party leaned hard into the freedom the EPRDF's non-alignment created, and it pushed towards the outright delinking from the old dependency structures, trying to get into the more multilateral frameworks, BRICS, the Belt and Road, New Development Bank. Um, but is it actually delinking? This is kind of where you have to go back and reapply Patnick again directly, because he kind of gives us this test. For Patnick, generally delinking means breaking the structure of the globalized financial capital and capital control, stemming from outflow surplus, kind of recapturing national economic sovereignty. Um, and that's not just swapping one core for another while another power is going to hold your debt. You run Ethiopia against this, right? The Prosperity Party hasn't exited the system. It's maximizing what it can while it's in it, while simultaneously, beginning to hedge bets in the BRI or hedge bets with the New Development Bank, not just switching one for one, US, Europe for China, but kind of building it out. And the government adjacent kind of Institute of Foreign Affairs has kind of laid this out as like a heavy bilateral risk of entrenchment, kind of playing on Patnick himself, where it is, fearful of swapping Western dependence or Western patronage for a Chinese one. And I think that just looking at Patnick's system, it comes back to a clear answer. It's not necessarily, I would say, not delinking. I would say it's delinking, but from both parties in a complicated, kind of bet, a gamble. Um, and it's a bet that may pay off, it may not pay off. And, Ethiopia has real chances of servicing debt easier with China than it does with the United States. And just looking at possibly going yuan for birr or birr for birr. The options are more functional inside the New Development Bank whenever it comes to that. But it's not seen as a complete break or a complete rupture from the system. So it's kind of a floated assumption. And I think that whenever you look at it from Patnick's frame, there is, I would say, some confluence with what he would attribute to as a positive uh, delinking, yet again, not going one patron for another. So now we get to the constants, constraints, and kind of the adjusting durability, right? We've walked through all four eras, so now we got to step back and ask the question, what holds the whole diagnosis together? And across the four radically different regimes, the monarchy, military Marxism, development state, liberal multipolarity, what didn't change? Because the things that stayed constant across all four are really the key to kind of the entire argument. They're the, controlled variables. So once you see them, we can kind of narrow it down, and the thesis kind of really becomes the only thing left standing. Um, so let's start with the hardest and the most negative one, and that's Ethiopia never democratized. Every single one of the regimes, no matter what its ideology, has been fundamentally closed. It's been authoritarian, single party, and it more or less, even when elections existed, it was relatively deficient. And it is a defect as a permanent feature, and a point of contention every single time the pendulum swings. And this isn't incidental. It's a founding reason why the EPRDF federalized the way it did. Think about the way or what they were reacting to. The Derg had just tried to homogenize the nation under the common Ethiopian identity, much like the Soviets did, kind of try and paint their framework over these Russians, Ukrainians, and Georgians, not to erase their ethnicity per se, but to kind of replace their loyalty. And the EPRDF looked at how entrenched those internal rivalries were and kind of made the opposite bet, to not paint, a picture over the top and federalize and push the problem of democratic contestation down to the polities rather than keeping it at the federal center, and keeping that federal center uniparty. And that's something Selassie tried to do, the Derg tried to do, and the Prosperity's trying to do now. And the PRDF was the one that didn't try and do it. Then there's the constant we already named, as kind of an anchor of the thesis, and that's state ownership. Under Article 40, Section 3, land and natural resources have belonged to the state since 1995, and it's been remained untouched as a principle ever since. Ownership's kind of fixed. And then we have one of the positive constraints. This is one that matters kind of the most, and that's the durability of institutional capacity in Ethiopia that kind of transcends the regime or even ethnicity or ideology. Like Ethiopian Airlines, it's been profitable expanding under all of the governments. The Development Bank of Ethiopia traces its respect to 1909 and has been renamed every single time but never dissolved. It's the same institution surviving every single one. And even the endowments and the SOE enterprise or apparatuses, um, for all of their failures, and they've produced some real results. And one of the most striking ones is the one in Tigray effort. Even with the war, the mines kept producing gold that found its way overseas, bypassing the national bank, and the capacity to operate never really disappeared. It just persisted through the worst rupture the state has faced. Now put those constraints together because this is the whole payload, right? The regime type constant, always authoritarian, ownership constant, and always state held, institutional capacity constant, always present. If all three of those are fixed across all four eras, then none of them can be what explains the enormous variance in outcomes, even the ones we've documented. The gap between the DERG and the negative growth and the EPRDF's decade of double digit between success and default, the variance has to come from one thing that did change. What each regime converted those fixed endowments into. The thesis isn't asserted here, it's kind of a residual, the only variable really left over, right? Whenever you've held everything else here as a constant. And that kind of settles the durability question properly, right? On raw years, Selassie had 33, and that beats the EPRDF's 27, sure. But adjusted for the constraint, Selassie's rule was largely unmobilized after he resettled from World War II, and his state completely fractured the moment mobilization actually happened. The moment you start to get these really big ethnic conflicts, and you started to, get the foundation of these militants, it just fractured. And then you have to look at the PRDF because they ruled over a fully mobilized, armed, multi-ethnic polity where only 6% govern the other 94%. That's the absolute hardest version of democratization, right? You got 6% governing 94%, and it lasted 27 years. And so when you look at it constraint adjusted, right, the EPRDF's federalism is probably the most durable answer anyone out of these four regimes have ever produced. And that's not because it democratized, because it didn't, 6% controlled 94, but because it was the smartest structural response to the constraint. Um, and the kind of the devolving the rupture pressure onto the polities rather than absorbing it at the center, held the state together for longer, right? And the concession rides right alongside it. The federalization that brought that durability and organized and armed the very identities, right, that eventually would fracture the state was kind of a double-edged instrument, but it was definitely the sharpest one tried, cutting both ways, and that's why the constraints define kind of the recommendations, what they can actually be, right? Because you can't prescribe democracy. It's never been the operative variable there. And you can't demand it as it's kind of ahistorical for a state that's never had it. You can't prescribe nationalizing resources because that's already a constant. It's already been done since 1995. But what you can prescribe is the redeployment of durable institutional capacity that already exists and already survives every regime, pointing what persists towards Ethiopia's actual comparative advantage. The constraints don't just diagnose a problem, they kind of define the solution space, and that's where we're going to have to go now. So here in section 5, we finally get our recommendations that we've been building so suspensively to, and we can actually kind of see what Ethiopia should do. So we're going to start with economic securitization and comparative advantage. Everything in the diagnostics points to one move. Four regimes in Ethiopia building to the one thing it has no comparative advantage in, industrial manufacturing. It's landlocked, it has no shipping, it's stuck under 4% of GDP despite decades of investment. That's a disadvantage the state keeps financing with borrowed money. And it's exactly what produced the conversion failure and the default. So I would say here's a decent pivot. Stop financing the disadvantage. Start capitalizing on the advantage. Ethiopia has got two real ones, genuine mineral wealth and a non-transitive geopolitical position. And we kind of mapped that earlier, right? So this is the developmental state agency layer we talked about being applied directly, not passively accepting the periphery role assigned, but capturing and possessing that one resource wealth as the financing base and using position as leverage, right? So on the geopolitical side, Ethiopia can pit its creditors against one another, right? They can service debt in birr or yuan, explore for resource for payment with China. One caution though, Angola and Venezuela took the resource um, backed loans and locked it in and below market terms and kind of got trapped. So I would say that's kind of like going back to Patnick again. The same tribe, just different outfit, right? You're not just doing raw loan. You're doing a loan for resource, and either way, it's still a debt trap. So this is kind of selective. Like you want to make sure it's don't do what Angola did. The currency piece matters the most, honestly, for Ethiopia here, because Ethiopia's birr and its debt is mostly owed in dollars, right? And that's a massive mismatch going back again to that wedge-shaped graph. Um, it doesn't make sense, and it becomes unpayable to an extent. So if shifting that debt is possible into yuan or even birr, um, it doesn't erase it, but it definitely moves it out of a currency trap that it's actively in the process of hemorrhaging. And I'd say there's kind of proof of concept here, for the broader, utilizing a single resource to kind of elevate and secure your economy. And that's kind of Saudi Arabia. They use the resource revenue to diversify their economy, to remake its economy. You got the Vision 2030, and it has genuinely worked to an extent. But it took, a sovereign wealth fund the size of national treasuries and, decades in the making. It wasn't quick to retrofit that, kind of escape hatch to kind of escape the Dutch disease or the resource curse. So it took a significant amount of time, and um, that's a part of why Ethiopia needs to start sooner rather than later, because as the process continues, it's not going to develop that war chest at current rate. It's only going to get worse. So it has to move to kind of capture that um, the rent, all the while, kind of build out its escape hatch as well, kind of expanding and diversifying its economy. But you have to have an economy first, and it it's one of those things to where it's better to be early and cheap and not late and expensive, right? And I think that one kind of downstream effect of this, though, is that Saudi's kind of a price setter, right? They're in a cartelized system, OPEC, where Ethiopia isn't. It's a price taker in gold. They don't produce the majority of gold. They are just a major gold producer. Um, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult um, to kind of capture that wealth. But as we keep going, we're going to kind of see, where that comes from. And that is kind of what leads us to formalize the artisanal gold sector, right? So this is pretty much one of the most cut and dry points of these prescriptions in the entire set of them, and that is arguably what makes, I think, the strongest, as it's not really a hypothesis. It's already been kind of proven by the government's own estimate. Up to 61% of Ethiopia's gold, around $6 billion per year, slips out informally, never touching the formal economy. And here's kind of the proof that it can be captured, because when the birr floated in 2024 and the NBE, the National Bank of Ethiopia, started paying a competitive rate for gold, supplied to the central bank jumped significantly. We're talking about from 4.2 tons to nearly 39. You're looking at a nine-fold improvement in a year. No new mines, no miners, not a single, crackdown on these illicit avenues. It's just the gold was there. The only thing that changed was the price. And so that's kind of, I'd say, a whole principle of this thesis, right? Is that compressed into one accidental experiment, the resource wasn't the constraint, the conversion mechanism was. It just wasn't priced in. So Do deliberately what the float did by accident would be one of my prescriptions. Don't do it by having the central bank overpay forever. The National Bank of Ethiopia captured gold through above market premiums, and by early 2026, an audit is showing that it's losing money doing so. So the structural fix is, set a realistic exchange rate here. Don't keep it going to where the spreadsheet narrows on its own. Basically just continue the pricing and just build that mechanism. And there's also a design balance to this too, right? Um, you know, Price out the willing majority, the roughly 1.25 million artisanal miners. There's a ton with a carrot of fair formal channels, but reserve enforcement for strictly militant capture here, right? Don't go after the miners, just what drives the darker avenues. Offer the localities a stake instead, building the endowment, a carrot for the many, security for the armed few, and ownership for the communities. And that takes us to slide 31. And that's the intrapot and integrity by security here. And so, quintessentially, you, I would postulate that an institutionalized intrapot and kind of integrity by security as a prescription is about not just capturing Ethiopia's own gold. This one's about capturing gold that's flowing through, right? The previous selection, the artisanal miners, the security apparatus, the enfranchisement, those are about capturing Ethiopia's gold. This is about capturing flows coming through Ethiopia. And turning what could be a liability, probably is realistically a current liability, into a comparative advantage playoff, right? Because Ethiopia sits at the Horn, right up against Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, the DRC, and there is tons of conflict gold from those places that are already transiting through Ethiopia towards Dubai, and concentrating at places like the Shire branch of the National Bank, right? That's one clear example. Um, and right now, Ethiopia is absorbing the risk of laundering foreign conflict assets without capturing any of the value. And that's just backwards, right? And fixing it is the offensive play to the pivot is pointed out here as a price taker. Ethiopia has to make the moves and be willing to make the moves to capture the margin, and that's the whole premise of the intrapot. Is you want to build the certification, build the refining capacity, and then Ethiopia stops being a leakage point and becomes what one could argue is a legitimate hub for growth inside the horn. Um, and capturing the process of margin on the gold that's already moving through there anyways. And I would say you could look to Dubai as an example of this, right? Dubai literally built an economy on this. Rwanda pretty much does the same thing with coltan. But there is kind of a razor's edge between being able to do it regulated in the right way and kind of just being a state-owned, um, laundry mat or washing machine. And I think the certification here is really separates that. Like real capacity, real chain of custody. And that lets Ethiopia capture legitimate regional gold while screening out the conflict gold from Sudan's war or the DRC's militants. Tolerating unscreened conflict gold isn't an entry pot. It is laundering, and that carries sanctions and exposure. And at this moment, Ethiopia is in no position to be uh, taking those risks. So it needs to do it by capturing those in a certified way, right? And capturing these flows are um, a part of dealing with the smuggling and the militancy also, targeted security, not blanket policing, like I mentioned before. Um, like we talked about with the UAE recording 15 tons of Ethiopian gold in 2021 against the barely 9 tons of production, that gold is leaving through militant captured mines, especially in Tigray. But this trade is interdictable. You don't need soldiers everywhere. The Kirkuk mine, a $500 million project, is sitting idle because of militants, right? And the site can't be cleared, and that's really stalled the value of what this is. But there's a design choice here that also makes security work instead of starting a new war, right? You can't send federal or OMO-led troops to seize mines in Tigray. That's a fresh conflict, not really a policy. The fix here is making sure the ethnic group is a shareholder, And in essence, what you should do is you should target these endowment models, effort, for example, in Tigray, or OMSC and Oromia, and use them deliberately as like not only profits for the community, but enabling the community to feel like they're a piece of the project. Um, and this isn't, the whole smuggler's protection racket or any like that. You're proposing a system that curbs the Tigray mining. It enfranchises people to do it the right way through the formalization, and the certification, and by pricing out the artisanal miners. And then you provide the governance with this endowment mechanism, and you put them all together in almost like a pincer maneuver, to where the shareholder stake pulls the community towards the formal channel, right? The security choke points off these illicit routes. And the formal mechanism becomes more profitable and less risky. So the community could effectively maybe police itself. So now we get to a problem here, and that's how do those endowments get extended across the whole of the polity? And from there, we have to look at SOE replication, federalization, and regionalization. And so, kind of, this brings us to the next move, right? Almost sequentially. And that's to take the pockets of the Ethiopian state that have actually worked and replicated, not the institutions operating on the principles of them, So the start with the cleanest success, Ethiopian Airlines, strict budget, disciplined, bound scope, no real big mission creep. And it's succeeded across all four regimes because of a hard budget, because it owns it, or it earns its own forex. It has to cover its costs. It's got a single mission. There's real discipline, um, regulatory bodies, and competitive elements to it that it can't make up. And those are solid variables to take into account. And the endowment model produced the same kind of success, and the caveats actually kind of prove the point rather than weaken it, I think, because effort before 2018, um, the Tigrayan endowment built a genuinely profitable business and produced regional revenue for over 2 decades. But what broke it was the war and the governance fight over control, right? Not the model itself. And OMSC, the Oromia mining arm, underperformed for the exact opposite reason, right? And it was due to in, an internal due diligence and governance breakdown. Exactly the failure the airline's discipline is built to prevent. One vehicle broke it from the outside shock, the other one from inside governance. Neither means endowments don't work. The conditions are the problem, not necessarily the model of it itself. So the prescription here is to distribute those amongst working principles. The airline's discipline, the efforts in its prime playbook, through development bank vehicles. And to be precise, I don't mean replicate the development bank of Ethiopia actually lending record. That serves as more of a precautionary tale, not a model, as it did have to get bailed out. But borrow the form, the development bank, as a capital distribution vehicle, and actually use it as a principle to kind of run regional development financing institutions coordinating through the federal level, imposing these bound missions, these hard budgets. And, without that discipline, you kind of continue to get these soft budget failures all over the place. So I think that the kind of builds the next prescription in and of itself. And that's the federal formula, expanded endowments, and regional cooperatives. So here again, we get the kind of the same argument, right? So Ethiopia has a general unusual system, right? Most states organize public investment vehicles by region. Ethiopia has chosen not to do that, and instead, what they have done is they've organized it by ethnicity. The endowments effort, Tunisia, aren't administrative bodies; they're investment vehicles for an ethnic polity. And the closest parallels really the tribal endowments of the indigenous nations. In the U.S., where collective wealth is held, and grown as a sovereign basis, or a sovereign style fund, um, this is more competitive, right? Uh, the tribes are minorities. They're enfranchised within the stable federal majority. They're not competing for a center. Ethiopia's ethnic groups are, the US's minority groups aren't. Um, they have that stable federal majority that is enfranchised, whereas Ethiopia doesn't. So they're constantly leveraging and competing, and so something Ethiopia has to do is a little bit more difficult, I would say, and that's extend this entire prospect to every major group at once. So no group needs to capture the center to secure its future, to secure the endowment. It almost has to become a universalized mechanism, which is part of leveraging the expanding the um, Development Bank of Ethiopia, to empower regional development banks to enable things like this endowment. And the model does work, with some caveats. Um, the INZA was gutted by the war, right? OSMCA faltered on its own governance, but neither really, like I stated previously, is a model failure. And I think there's a fact here that kind of reframes it all. And that's when you look at the groups that have endowments, Effort for Tigray, Tumza for Oromia, Teret for Amhara, Wundo for the South. Uh, they historically have been powerful regions. The poorest regions, Somalia, Afar, Gumza, Gambela, they have none. The endowment system currently tracks power, not need, right? It's quintessentially been a problem of that elite capture we talked about earlier. So the prescription's got two axes, I would argue, pulling in opposite directions on purpose, I would say. Expand access, break the political gatekeeping, build the vehicles for the establishment, for the excluded, um, and tighten operations. Hold everyone to the discipline um, that we established, right? Free the capital, but discipline the vehicle. And I think that the payoff is no ethnic groups ever dominated Ethiopia and top-down national. No ethnic group, sorry, no ethnic groups ever dominate Ethiopia, and every top-down ethnic national identity has failed, right? The EPRDS federal frame is the most functional answer that we addressed in the previous section, and it stops trying to make one group win. And universalizing the endowments fills that frame. When every group's a shareholder in the state, ethnic success and state success converge, right? You can replace this zero-sum fight with a more positive sum stake in the whole. And there's a second structural problem underneath the federal formula, and that's the rural subsistence economy, the non-participators. And let me frame this clearly and carefully because it's easy to hear the wrong way. And that is the issue isn't that these people are a drain, right? It's structural. A huge share of the workforce farms at a subsistence level, sitting almost entirely outside of the fiscal market system. And they say that way, and they stay that way for a rational reason, right? The state's never made integration worth their while. The same incentive problem with gold. Not a character flaw, it's generally just one of the constraints. It caps the fiscal base and leaves communities individually fragile, right? One drought from catastrophe. The exact structure behind every major famine that's haunted every era. The Derg understood this problem, to be fair. And their solution, coercive collectivization, tearing people off their land, failed horribly. And it produced state farms that managed just 6% of output. And the lesson isn't don't integrate the peasantry, it's that coercion's the wrong um, instrument for this. And here's why the cooperative's the right frame, I would argue, for Ethiopia specifically. The correct path depends on your factor of endowment. Okay, the U.S. is corporatized, consolidated, capital intensive, freehold. It doesn't need cooperatives, and if it was to nationalize, the institutions are there, the mechanisms there. Ethiopia is the inverse of that. Most of these rural agri focused environments are um, small holders, right? Their economies are small, and basically they reach the scale of corporate through consolidation, right? So I think two precedents can set this, and that's China's household responsibility system, which kept land collectively owned but devolved production to households, and credit with a real surge in output from the bottom up, right? Such as the town and village enterprises. So it's the household system helped generate the town and village enterprises. And then there's the Mexican Ihoja. ihojo, which is communal land granted by the state, right? The term literally means endowment. And members hold use rights but can't really sell them, nearly spot on with Article 40, Section 3. Um, and its government is designed to prevent illegal capture. And it's the 1992 privatization under NAFTA pressure produced land and inequality, right? It's literally the warning um, that this exact type of externally forced liberalization, right? 40 Section 3 protects Ethiopia from right now. So I think that locally initiated community-driven cooperatives at the Kili level, starting with coffee, right? It's one of their biggest exports, and kind of growing from there, pooling farms, and it helps to take and atomize these houses and grow them into larger polities and more powerful entities. So a big principle here is the multipolarity play, right? And that's finally kind of converting this linchpin, alleviating your crushing debt while converting your position of neutrality that you've developed over time into something that's tangible and beneficial. And the core logic is kind of the thing that fixes what broke last time. The EPRDF's debt became unpayable partially because it was Burr that owed dollars, right? And it doesn't have dollars, but what it does have is gold, um, tantalum, sorry, lithium. So why? So pay in what you have, right? Resource linked joint ventures with China or Saudi Arabia or the UAE, where Ethiopia's own minerals can serve as the collateral, and the counterparty's capital is the input, right? Um, Work the float between the patrons, the UAE, China, Saudi, and the West, right? The MBD in China often offer lower rates and serve to have a little bit more risk tolerance than Western institutions. Um, so you could finish your NDB session, right, and kind of shop those relationships against one another. And a country that can credibly walk between these relationships gets better terms from everyone. That's the neutrality that they've worked on, converted into a point, and it remains open a point to be protective of because you do want to protect against capture again. You know, you don't want to uh, fall into the framework of just becoming someone else's, a patron, another patron. You don't want to fall into another patronhood. Um, the luck of the Dergs collapse freed them from that, and it's something they should be cautious of falling into. And it's a threat that does potentially sit with China or other counterparties' resource for loans, and it's something to keep an eye on, honestly. And here's kind of another catch to that too, though, is the framework that um, restructuring the 4.9 billion dollars anchored by the IMF is unrealistic, right? The NDB has dispersed nothing to Ethiopia yet, and the whole principle is that you don't want to cause an undue collapse or an undue rupture. You want to graduate it. Don't do a full swap. Graduate the process. You know, take advantage of more beneficial loans where you can, and slowly migrate the money from dollars to resources, or from dollars to yuan, or dollars to birr, and begin that process that way. So bringing this extremely long uh, analysis to a close, um, more or less, I've made four core prescriptions. Right, first the gold sector, formalize the artisanal sector. Channel, add the integrity and the security conditions, build the institutionalized intrapot, right? Legitimate means, capture not just Ethiopia's own production, but the regional flows already moving through it. Legalize what's currently illicit, make it a buck, certified. The float that we already have ran as an experiment by happenstance, and prove that the movement's there within gold and within other mineral resources as well. And if done deliberately, this could roughly double Ethiopia's realized gold revenue. And then secondly, redeploy the state's apparatus, expand the state-owned industries and the regional industries, the endowments, the TVEs, invest into these rural cooperatives, but do it correctly identifying what made Ethiopian Airlines succeed, right? Not where the other ones failed, but take a durable look at the failing institutions like the Development Bank of Ethiopia and turn it into a disciplined vehicle that can drive these principles forward to these endowments, to these regional cooperatives, um, and direct that development in a structured, built up way with constraints. And then third, and this is what I would say is Ethiopia's most unique, the federal formula and the endowments, right? Already touched upon them, but Ethiopia has the machinery, the ethnic regions with their own institutions, their own endowments, the apparatus to let these groups participate in a system together. It just takes the will to expand it to all of these ethnic groups, not just the few, powerful few, letting each embrace its own cooperative, comparative advantage while serving the state. And fourth, flowing right from that is bring rural subsistence communities and bring in these rural subsistence communities and marginalized groups, not by forcing them into a collective, but by giving them the means to build cooperatives from the ground up, making them more durable, laying infrastructure for endowment growth down the line. And underneath all four of those, running the sequence kind of financial alignment. Leverage the neutral position to refinance out of the dollar into the birr, yuan, resource for investment, gradually, in parts, so Ethiopia doesn't get captured by one side or the other and doesn't also risk an undue rupture. But here's what actually ties all of these together, I believe, and it's the kind of the whole thesis arriving back, kind of where it started, is look at every one of these, look at what more or less all of these prescriptions are doing. You're capturing gold that's already produced, redirecting institutional capacity that already endures, universalizing ethnic structures that already exist, connecting rural labor that's already there, and leveraging a neutral position that Ethiopia already holds. Not one of these is about acquiring something Ethiopia lacks. Every single one is about converting something that is already there but has failed to capture. And that's the entire argument of the presentation in one just eloquent line, right? Ethiopia's constraint was never its endowment. It's it was conversion, state-owned enterprise, institutional capacity, resource wealth, geopolitical position, all constant, all present in every era. What varied and what these prescriptions target is the quality of conversion. Everything Ethiopia already needs, it has. The question was never acquisition, it was always conversion. Now, because analysis that can't be wrong isn't analysis, let me be more explicit about what could prove my framework wrong and what separate that from what could just derail it. So, what would prove the diagnosis wrong? If the Eurobond restructuring completes cleanly and the debt turns out to be manageable. Without any of this, then the conversion failure I've centered was less binding than I'd claimed, and as we stand now, it doesn't look likely, but it's a test. And if Ethiopia recoups its collapsed tax revenue on its own, the fiscal disconnection, diagnosis weakness, and if a new census got conducted and the demographic or ethnic composition had shifted dramatically, the federal formula prescription may be resting on stale ground, right? Though, honestly, looking at Ethiopia's history, I'd rate that as least likely to surprise us. Um, and then separately, what could derail a prescription even if the diagnosis is exactly right? These aren't exactly flaws in the analysis. They're just external shocks that could collapse any sort of implementation regardless. And that's the regional ethnic conflicts, the spillover from Sudan's war, a rupture in the Gulf, or with Western allies, a full collapse of the bond restructuring. Any one of these things could throw a wrench in the whole thing. And a correct framework can still get overtaken by events. But the framework itself, I believe, rests on the single most durable finding in a century of Ethiopian history. And that's that the state never lacked what it needed. It only ever struggled to convert it. And that conversion, not acquisition, is where Ethiopia's development has always been won or lost, and where it's going to inevitably be decided again. Well, I appreciate you guys sticking with me for way too long of an analysis, but I enjoyed it, and I was really looking forward to doing this project. So, um, yeah, here are some of my references. And here are some more of my references. Again, it was a great course. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed this project. And again, sorry for the length.